Thank you, Julie. And talk a little bit what we're going to talk about today. My name is Donna Recht, and I am a long-term teacher. The second year I taught kindergarten and first grade. It was sort of a short-lived period because I really realized that they'd like to grumble and complain, but I realized in that interim that I didn't know enough about teaching reading. So I went back and got my master's in reading. I then ended up working as a reading specialist for a middle school in Oak Park, Illinois, then came to Milwaukee. I got my license as assistant principal. I taught for a long time at UWM, teaching new teachers how to teach reading. I moved to Stritch, and I became head of the reading clinic at the Reading Center at Stritch, became an elementary principal, and then went back to Stritch to train teachers, experienced teachers to become principals. It sounds like I did a lot of job hopping, right? But I do have a lot of expertise in reading, and I've been really enjoying following it. So what I'd like to talk to you about today, and then I'm very eager to answer any questions you have or observations, is, the question is, we learned to read just fine. Why is learning to read so hard? So we're going to just talk a little bit about why learning to read is hard, and then the stakes involved. We have a lot of very good statistics to talk about why learning to read by the end of third grade has high stakes statistics for the kids who are involved and for us as a society. Then we're going to talk a little bit about how reading is taught in schools and very briefly, how it evolved and where it is now. And then I'm going to give you a lot of the information about the new report card that just came out about where we are. And then we're going to sort of end about what we can do as parents, what we can do as grandparents, what we can do as volunteers. And so we have a lot to cover in a little bit of time. So I'd like you to turn to a neighbor at your table. And I want you to look at those two. Could you read the sentence to your neighbor and pronounce the two words in red and try to figure out what that means? I'll give you about 2 minutes. Okay, so Maureen, what's your idea about how to pronounce the A word? Perfect. And a second? Okay, you can read the words just fine. So tell me what it means.
I'm guessing by the context, which most people do when they're reading.
Yep.
They can read a little bit, like the separation that can form a closed system over and over.
Close. I'm just going to tell you. My husband and I just had the trip of a lifetime to go see polar bears in Churchill, Manitoba, 900 miles north of Winnipeg in the Arctic. And so I've been reading about the Arctic, which just fascinates me. Anyhow, abulation is the loss of ice from any reason. And then a pingo is a conical hill with a core of clear ice. So my point is, you can read just fine, but if you don't have the vocabulary and you don't have a rich context, as you were saying, you're sort of stymied. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the stakes here. Reading is sort of a multi-step process. So we have sight vocabulary, which is words that you learn to memorize, that you recognize on sight. And then to be a successful reader, used her internal phonetic schema to figure out what the word said. And then context, and then you need some comprehension of what you've read. And then to add to all this, you want, by the end of third grade, fluency. Fluency means speed. So when you have like a kindergartner or first grade, they're just plodding along, you know, trying to recognize the words that they know and decode the word they don't know. And so they are slow as molasses in January. But by the end of third grade, you want speed, some fluency. And the statistics are very raw. Where you are in 95% of the cases at the end of third grade is where you are as a senior in high school, if you graduate as an 18-year-old. So if you're a good reader by the end of third grade with all of these, you're going to be a successful reader by the end, by 18. And if you really struggle, and so K3 is very high stakes. So let's just go back to this a little bit. Some of us as parents and grandparents know one of the things that we can do that is completely the most helpful is to what are the foundations of reading? Well, one of the best things if you come into kindergarten or first grade is that you have the love of reading. We all read to kids, we buy them books. That's one of the best things that you can do. So they have a pleasurable experience when they come into this hard part of actually learning what the words are. Another thing is the vocabulary exposure. You weren't very exposed to my pingos, but they're very quite magnificent and when you see them. But the vocabulary is very stark as well. We know that in the preschool years, the exposure to words and vocabulary, this is just the stream of thought. This is not stopping to identify all the meaning of words. In a low socioeconomic family who are struggling, is 616 words per hour of listening and speaking. Now that doesn't seem, I mean, that may seem like a lot of words, 616 per hour. But if you compare it to the median, it's 1,251 words per hour. If you compare it to a professional family, 2,153 words per hour. So you're talking about a vast amount of difference. And when we go back to being read to, another high predictor of success in reading is whether the mother likes to read and reads to the child. So that's another big issue. And of course we know we don't send our kids to kindergarten without knowing their letters, without knowing their letter sounds. But if you come into a kindergarten situation with all these kids which have not been equally exposed to language, that don't know their letter sounds, that really don't see learning to read as anything but a lot of work. You're starting with a really unequitable situation. And so, in English, English is a very confounding language. It has a lot of regular words that are decodable, and they have a lot that are not decodable. So for example, if we take this little chart here, and we have all these decodable words over here, and we have all these. So if I would follow the rules of English, that would be said, or O is an octopus, off, off. So you have to figure out vocabulary. Now, one of the issues about vocabulary, I think that's quite very difficult, is to learn a sight word. So if we're going to learn said, for example, a smart kid needs between 10 and 15 exposures to that sight word to learn that word. Now, if you are talking about a kid who has more trouble, who has it is between 17 and 22. Some kids who are learning disabled need more than 22 exposures. And so if you're thinking about acquisition of sight vocabulary, you're talking about regular exposed practice to all those words. If we go on, let's just look at this just for a moment. So, you know, here is the process. So if we're going to Pingo again, we see Pingo, we go into phonetic decoding. Okay, we know the letter sounds, but it requires pa, I, ing, go. So you have to recognize the words, blend them together, and then you check out the picture, if you had a picture, and then to see if it makes sense, and go on from there. So you have a lot of problems that you can see. What happens if you're not good here? You have some phonemic awareness problems underlying phonics, or haven't been taught good quality phonics. You don't have the building blocks to this. And so what you find is a lot of kids doing is they read the words they know, guess on the first letter, look at the picture, and make predictions. And so it is a process that will only get you so far in this whole process. So I just want to take you back briefly in terms of what we would call basal readers or instructional materials to the McGuffey readers. So we have the very beginning of books that were given to teach kids to read back in 1839. So
I remember that one well.
I bet you remember Dick and Jane, right? Okay, so I have at your table a couple of books, and just take about a minute to look through that and tell me what kind of approach do you think that is? Anybody want to venture a prediction of what this approach might be? Phonics, yes. So you're introduced to the letter, you practice the letter. Who sees a downside in this?
You're not sounding everything out because you're looking at the picture all the time. You're sure
That's true. Any other downsides you see? It is so boring. So boring. And so, you know, because you're dealing with phonetically regular words, you don't have much of a story to go on. So if we transition to using sight vocabulary and we go back to you, is we have Dick and Jane, right? Dick runs with the dog, we have Spot, we have the exciting things. So that's like a sight word approach, using the picture, using the context. And then if we're fast forwarding, of course, because of the time, we're going to go to what's called balanced literacy. And balanced literacy has been very, very much in the schools for the last 15 years. And the whole aim of balanced literacy is that you have in your classroom, I would have a book box. So I would have books at my table that are at my instructional level. Instructional level means that I can read about 95% of the words in that. So it's sort of like an individualized books that I can read. So the teacher would do a short lesson, usually on phonics. Then you would be doing some reading to yourself. Lots and lots of writing involved with this. And I'm just going to give you an example of how we might do this. So we have an old woman. They're trying to pull out the big, enormous turnip. I'm just going to read you 2 pages. You get the idea. The granddaughter pulled the old woman pulled the old man pulled the turnip, and they pulled and pulled again, and they could not pull it up. Here's the turnip. The granddaughter called the black dog. She said, "Come help with the turnip." So you get the pattern. The dog helped the granddaughter helped the old woman helped the old man. So you're getting the rhyming, you're getting the repetition. So if you've been taught sight vocabulary, and then you're checking with the pictures, of course, to see who's in the line, so if you miss something out. Now, balanced literacy still is in many, many schools. So there has been called the last, would you say 5 years? 5 years, it's a reading wars. The people who really want explicit instruction in phonics to come about have been very critical of balanced literacy. And so you see now a real push to, in addition to teaching something like this, which has really good parts of it. I mean, you have an individualized box, you have small group instruction, you have large group instruction, but you don't necessarily, unless you've adapted, have lots of systematic instruction in reading. And so sort of that's, given I want to cover other things, I really want to go on to this one, which I think is a really important thing. So why is reading harder than it used to be? So that would be like the good old days, right? So I think some of the issues here is our school issues. If you're thinking about having 15, 16, 17 kids in a first grade versus 30, I mean, class size makes an enormous difference. Then you have the best predictor is teacher experience, and a good teacher is like nothing else. And so many teachers now have one course in reading, perhaps, so they're teaching a course, they're teaching a whole first grade to learn to read based on one course. And school culture. Now, Alan Bursick was here a couple weeks ago. How many of you heard him? He was excellent. He's really a favorite of mine. But what he said is the most important thing in good quality schools in Milwaukee, and I think it's everywhere, is strong leadership, good staff, and clear goals. And so if you are in the midst of chaos, you don't have strong leadership, you don't have an experienced staff, and you don't have clear goals, then that school factor is going to be a huge, huge issue. And the other thing is it's way cooler to be a reader in Whitefish Bay than it is in inner city Milwaukee. You have the whole culture. And when I talk about school culture, I mean how things are done around here, how things are around here. You have that peer pull against. Now, in terms of our life as parents, grandparents, interested people, is you have a whole lot of other things going on. I think we have, and kids certainly have, a divided attention span. You go from one thing to another thing. They're listening to something on their phone. They're doing this test. There's many things going on. And reading really requires sustained attention. And so that really interferes. I think the big thing is you're competing. You're competing with soccer practice. You're competing with your phone. You're competing. Kids are really way more interested in talking to their friends than they are, spending a half an hour reading a book. And then this whole thing about motivation. If we go back to what we were talking about at the beginning, learning to read by the 3rd grade, by the end of 3rd grade, you have a huge motivational thing going on. It's just like us. We start a sport, and it's hard work. You have to practice, you have to get good at it, you have to stay with it. But if it's hard, and every sentence is hard, you say, enough already. I think that this is not something I want to spend time on. So, okay, so let's just give you a little statistics, because I think that you hear this in the paper. And I'm going to give you 3 different, very recent statistics about reading achievement. Now, this first one is done by the NAEP, which is the National Assessment of Progress. It does not give you reading results on a single kid. So it would be, you're looking for generally a comparison of what people know and are able to do. So you're looking, across the big picture. When we look at this scale of 220, the reason that they use this scaled score, the highest is 500, is because you want to track kids over time. So if you would have a child that is a 2.1 reader in the beginning of 2nd grade, the next year he's in 3rd grade. So you don't want to compare apples to oranges. You want to keep comparing apples to apples to apples. So that's why you have this kind of thing. Now you can see that it is tracked since 1971 to 2022. Now these are 9-year-olds. And so one of the things that you see about 9-year-olds is that if you compare it back to 1971, this is this year. What do you think? We're doing better, right? Over all that time. But if you look at 2000 compared to 2022, we're down 5 points. And so so we're down 5 points in reading and 8 points in math. So remember, it's my 9-year-olds I'm worried about. This is the end of 3rd grade. So we're down already. Okay, so let's just take COVID. And so if we take COVID, I'm just going to tell you how this works. Again, we have the same 500 scale score. And what this particularly does is it measures if you are in the 90th percentile when we compare 2020 and 2022. So you can see, the first thing you can see is everybody is down. So your good kids are down. But when we're looking at the 25th percentile or below, you're now down 10 points. So that's really a significant. So that was very quick. So what questions do you have about this chart?
No, you're good, but then
with the bottom there, looking at the 196 and 188, and then the 164, can you explain a little bit more about that?
Okay, so you can see that here is the difference between 90 and 75th. This is the kids who are in the below 20. So they went down from 196 down to, you see, this would be the 10 percentage, et cetera. And so
we went 196 to 188.
yeah, 196 to right. And then this would be then the 10%, the very bottom of the range.
Donna, can you go back to the slide that you had right before this one? The looks like there was like a 10-point jump from 99 to 2012. What do you like? What accounts? Like, what happened in there? Is that this new reading method?
Yeah, it is new reading method. You have a lot of veteran teachers still, the baby boom teachers. You know, it was a time of growth. It was a time of, you know, real optimism. And in this reading wars, it was very much a time that people were really thinking, okay, we've got this. We're really, really making progress here. And that's a pretty significant rise. And then we had a leveling off. And then they expect that this is not going to keep cratering down because we're back in person.
Sure. Yep.
In the 1980s, we saw a similar dip, and I would say that, you know, so our current time is not our only dip. We've had a dip before.
Yeah.
And so do we really get all that concerned about the current dip?
I think it's a reason to be doing something about it. And I think overall, the dip, it will either level out or probably go up now that we're back in person. The things I worry about is the quality of the teaching, to make schools a stable place for learning. And I do worry about this K-3 population. But you're absolutely right. We've had a dip before.
So I'm curious about the next graph again. So the way I would read it is that's a cross-sectional, 2 time points, but cross-sectional, looking at 9-year-olds in 2020 and then 9-year-olds again in 2022. Is that correct?
Yes.
So I guess what I'm curious, so I'm not surprised that it's negatively skewed. You kind of see that, I would imagine. So what I'm curious is what the data say for those same 9-year-olds as then their 11-year-olds, and are the top ones progressing more, and then are the bottom ones also failing to progress as much as you would anticipate?
This
'Cause that'd be
particular
even more alarming.
This particular one is 4th through 8th graders. The one before, no, you're right. This was in general. This is our 3rd grade population. Here is our 4th and 8th grade population. So I'm going to use the pointer because this is a little confusing. So the way that the NAEP test does it is it has the advanced, and the advanced, let's just talk about the test for a moment. It doesn't test word recognition, it doesn't test vocabulary, it doesn't test phonics. It tests, can you read and you can understand? For example, the basic right here would be something like read a story and generalize how the character feels, or what a word means in context. The proficient would be discuss a character's situation from the story. The advanced requires students to evaluate the story and form an opinion. So it's something you'd really want in life, but it's not the same kind of measure as other reading tests. And so I'm just going to show you as a nation and then as these are all the biggest urban areas, and this is MPS. So you have this little slice here is the whole nation. My statistic, the whole nation is 8% of kids are advanced. If you think about proficient, and remember proficient was be able to evaluate a character's situation from the story, the average is 24%, and then 29%, and there's still, as a nation, we're 39% below basic. When we take large cities, we're talking about here, 47%, 27%, 19%, 4%, and here's MPS. MPS is 67% below basic, and then only 21%. So I guess I do worry, about our urban areas. And I think that it's a hard test, but it's a test that's really important. I'd like to go on to what we can do to help, and then some ideas about other areas. Okay, so some of these are just sensible. What you can do is do lots of prior knowledge, lots of expanding vocabulary, lots of reading to them. So I'm a grandparent, and I have very little influence in the area of, having them practice reading every night. I know in our particular situation is we have these grandparents, we know how important the practice is. You just don't get good at anything without practice. And so it's just not enough to read in school. You want to read something that's at instructional level 20 to 30 minutes every single day. And I know from just having been there yesterday, we have much hockey going on and hockey practices and all sorts of other things going on. I think even with the most dedicated parents, it's tough now, because how do you compete with all of that? And then supporting preschool education, such as Head Start, et cetera. So in Milwaukee, lots of us are concerned about this and want to help. And so what can we do? Well, there are many areas if you would like to volunteer. So there are quite a number of one-to-one tutoring sessions. An example comes up with the Literary Services of Milwaukee. They want you to commit to one 90-minute period. They do, their center is in Plankington, so you can do it in person, you can do it remotely. And they have an interesting situation now that they're doing remote tutoring into jails. And so that would be a good use of volunteer time. The materials that they give you are pretty prescribed. So it's not like you have to have this huge background in reading. Some criticize it is because in some areas you get a new person every week. A lot of times you're getting adults who are learning to read, immigrants are learning to read, which is wonderfully satisfying. But you can stay with the same person. I just was talking to somebody the other day who has been doing it on Zoom. So, that's certainly a possibility. There are other possibilities. For example, Nextdoor has a program on 29th and Capitol. And then you can work with their young kids. You can work with their kindergarten age kids. UWM has another. These are all sort of one-to-one literacy. One that I've become really interested in, and I think I'm going to spend some time doing, is the reading that is common ground, is forward scholars. Have you heard of that, Seth?
I've heard of it. I don't know very much about it.
Well,
the Beloved Community Team, I don't know if there's a member here on that group, but they were talking about looking into it because it sounded very intriguing.
So what they have done is they've taken, these are mostly metro, lot of inner city churches. And the only one that I have found is, there are 40 of them. The St. Mark's is a member. So I have joined because, I know a lot of people in reading. And so they have 5 sites around the city. And the problem with an area like the Literary Services is that you're sort of doing it not necessarily individualizing to the person because they have to control for the fact that you may not know much. And so this is an interesting one because they assess K-3 kids where they are, and then a volunteer from the church volunteers twice a week at one of the sites, and they have morning and afternoon sites, and so you'd have the same kids all the time. So they got a lot of funding for this, and they hired a director through Common Cause, Common Ground, and then each site has a site director. And so when you go into the room, they have assessed where the kid is already, and they give you materials for their next step. So you spend 45 minutes teaching and then 15 minutes writing it up. So you're seeing the same kids all the time. So I think it's a really promising thing. And, you know, I would be glad to be an advocate because I've been in contact with them for our church. There also is like homework situations. United Way has a fairly good book donation. So you pay a certain amount, you can adopt a child, and you're providing them books. So there are ways definitely to help. So I think we're about on target. So yes.
Just from a really practical standpoint, say you're reading with a child, grandchild, or a child, and they are struggling with a word.
Mm-hmm.
How would you recommend that the parent or the grandparent help them figure out how to read that word?
Well, first of all, what age are we talking about? Or is this any age?
Any age.
Okay. So do they know most of the words?
I don't know. I mean, if they just get maybe, but maybe they don't. Maybe they just see an unfamiliar word and they're trying to read it and they don't know what it is.
Okay, so what I would do is the amount of unfamiliar words, or the words, the instructional level, they should know 90% of the words. If you're at instructional level, you're not going to be encountering all that many words that they don't know. And so one of the things that I would do is I would have them read to the end of the sentence and then come back and just say to them, okay, this word you don't know, let's figure out how you'd attack it. So what would you do? You know, lots of times the most common approach is they know the first letter, and then after that they know the last letter, and then they squish up the vowels because vowels are so irregular and uncommon. So I'd say, okay, based on the context, what do you think that word can mean? And then I would cover up parts of the word to try to figure out, can they attack, you know, the first part? So you have a lot of things going on. You have, I think one of the things that makes reading the hardest is that you have to keep in mind what you've been reading about and what the general story is about. Then you have this word you don't know, and then you're trying to sound it out. Let's say it has 3 syllables, so you finally get to the A-B, and then you go to the next one. And then by that time, do they have the memory to put them together, and do they have the blending capacity to put them together?
So do you recommend that they sound out the letters as far as use their letter knowledge to sound out the word using the phonics knowledge they have?
Mm-hmm. Or you can do it by word patterns. You're really trying to help them. And remember, a lot of kids come to school, they don't know that English goes left to right. And so you're really wanting to, as you read, trace under the sentence, you come to a word, you cover the part of the word. What is that word? Okay, it's ab. Let's look at this part. Let's look at this part. Because you're going to be much more successful if you can do bigger chunks, like syllables rather than individual words, because you're just going to exceed short-term memory. Catherine.
I would never think of disagreeing with Donna. When I got my master's degree in reading at Stritch, Donna literally wrote the books on the teaching of reading. But I think right now I'm going to disagree, Donna.
Go ahead.
You're the parent reading with the child or the grandparent or the auntie. One of your very first slides was make it pleasurable.
Mm-hmm.
Tell the kid the word and go on.
Mm-hmm.
Would you disagree?
No, I think you have to figure out what the purpose is. You know, is the purpose you want them to enjoy it, et cetera?
And another thing, all through my teaching of reading and all through my coursework, we were taught, you know, reading 15, 20 minutes a day, wonderful. But then at one point I heard talking to the child individually 15 minutes a day. You say 15 minutes a day. It's a long time to be with a child without any device in front of them. And that's where the vocabulary comes from. That's where the background knowledge comes from. Talking to the child. We're not all teachers.
Mm-hmm. 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 Thanks.
I have a question about reading and using your phone. It seems to me that we think of reading as books or papers or something. But it strikes me that because young people are on their phones all the time, they're reading off of the phones. And that might be another device that we can use to make reading more pleasurable or more interesting.
I think whatever works.
And I have a second question, and that is, do you recommend reading mostly with phonics, or the blend is better?
I think the pragmatics is that the blend is better. Kids are not going to be interested in reading boring stuff. And so I think, if I think about balanced literacy that's in the schools that I talked about before, I think what they can do is still keep the book boxes, still keep the emphasis on all the writing that they do, and you can see where their phonics is by their writing, because at the beginning they're very phonetic. But to introduce, so you're augmenting what already is a good thing. I'm never for throwing out the baby with the bathwater. I'm really saying, I think that we can do more work. And one of the things that we know is that if they don't have a good, what's called phonemic awareness coming into kindergarten, phonemic awareness is the ability to rhyme. I mean, we used to do all these nursery rhymes. Rhyme, you know, so with our granddaughter, we go, okay, I'm thinking of hen. What happens if you take off the H and you get what I mean? We just keep doing ben and hen and et cetera. So the really early exposure to that phonemic awareness, and see if you can make it a game. It's called, you know, phonetic deletion. You take off the first letter. Can you put on a new letter? So if we have ben, can we take off the B and put in a T? What do we get? So it's really that sensitivity to phonics. And one of the big causes now in dyslexia is that we know that it's very difficult for some of the kids who have dyslexia. They don't have a normal phonemic awareness, which requires much more systematic instruction. And also, if you have a child who doesn't learn well, you remember we're talking about with the sight words? You're talking with normal kids. They need 10 to 15 exposures. Are you only on 11? Or if you have a kid who learns with more difficulty, are you only on 24? So it's not like you can give up on this. I think you have to keep the sight words, the phonics, the enjoyment, the teacher reading to them. You know, all these things are so much one part. You have another.
Would you say reading is more of a word memorization, or do they need the decoding as well?
Well, it's just like in my example of Pingos. When you come to a word you don't know, and especially if you have a lot of words you don't know, you have to have some kind of device to figure out what the word is. And so once you get the word by phonics, do you know the vocabulary? But otherwise, you have kids that are just guessing, and then by the end of 3rd grade, this guessing just doesn't, it's just too much volume. And so you have to.
Donna's husband here is a neuropsychologist, so I will have something to say about this question. You can't memorize words in reading without phonics. It may seem like you're doing something different, but they all go together. And so when somebody appears to be just memorizing it, they're still using phonics. They're doing it fast. They're doing it more automatically. Make sense?
I don't expect you to have stats right at the ready, but in terms of reading scores around the world, the pandemic had this effect where it was like worldwide. I guess that's intrinsic to a pandemic. Has everybody suffered in the same way that we have? Do you know?
You know, one of the joys of being retired is that I keep up as much as my interest level goes,
Sure.
but I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah. Okay.
I would suspect so.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because in many countries there wasn't, at least we had a lot of access to computers in homes, but without,
Sure.
I'm guessing that's the case. Okay, one final question.
So it annoys the heck out of me when they're books for little kids who are just beginning to kind of learn the alphabet, and they'll have, for example, the letter E is elephant, which is not the way the E sounds. Are there any books that you think are just fantastic in that as they're teaching the alphabet, they're giving the real sound of the letter represented?
That would be, again, I'm not current enough. That's a really good question, though.
Jim.
To address that question, I was a teacher a former teacher in a high-performing charter school in Milwaukee, city of Milwaukee, for 8 years, and one of these schools used these, in front of the room, the alphabet letters A through Z, and A has many sounds and many spellings, and daily we had to go through with our kids at a specific time, usually the morning when everyone's fresh, this sort of chant about how A can be spelled so many different ways. And that was used to help them with their figuring out words. There are so many ways, not just phonics, there's sight words that they do learn and to some extent do memorize over time. Phonics certainly helps, and other modalities as well, which you've pointed out. But there are many ways to spell a sound, and so we try to equip them when they're reading with, that's a spelling of A, so let's try that. And that is one of many ways that this particular school wanted to have the kids learn in a sort of a daily chant. Not that anybody has to do that, but that's all.
Well, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Donna.
So, Catherine,